In the middle of winter, a homeless man stood tucked under the Hanover awning, his faded jacket soaked with cold, one hand gripping his backpack strap as if holding on to the last bit of warmth. People passed him the way they pass something without weight. The wind cut hard, and he tried to make himself smaller in the middle of life. Mercer appeared in the range yard, his eyes sweeping from Eli's shoes up to his face, the look of someone who believed power rested firmly in his own hands. "Who let you in here?" he said loudly, enough to make a few people stop and watch a weak man being pushed into a corner. No one knew that the man being looked down on had once been an air reconnaissance marksman, the sole survivor of a helicopter crash that erased his entire team from the map. Once a figure people respected, now, trembling hands, a gaunt face, and nights jolted awake by rotor blades living in memory. Mercer stepped closer, his voice mocking every word. "Looking like this, I even doubt you could hold a gun." Eli looked up, his gaze was calm, but sharp enough to make Mercer hesitate for half a beat. The moment was small, but it marked the line between what everyone thought they saw and the truth about to be completely overturned. If you're still reading, don't leave. What comes next will make you rethink how you treat strangers, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told more often, leave a comment or share it now. Don't let it pass the way people passed by Eli. Night wrapped the entire city in a thick crust of frost. Wind from the industrial district carried a faint metallic tang, funneled through narrow alleys, making the shop signs rattle softly. Eli Ward walked close to the wall, his old coat worn thin at the shoulders and barely holding any warmth. He pulled the collar tight against his skin, head lowered to escape the cold that lashed at his face like a thin blade. His feet were numb from walking too long, yet he kept a steady pace, neither fast nor slow, like someone used to clinging to each breath to keep from falling. Each gust through the alley dragged scraps of paper along, giving him the uneasy sense of footsteps following behind. He did not turn until the sound of metal clattering rang out. Eli startled and spun around, body tense to defend itself, eyes wide as they searched the dark. It was only a can knocked from a trash bin by the wind, rolling a few turns before coming to a stop. He held his breath, pressed a hand to his chest, as if checking whether his heart still kept its rhythm, then muttered, almost breathing more than speaking, "Just the wind." A man passed by wearing a knit cap, his face marked by the fatigue of a night shift. The man looked at Eli for a few seconds, wary, then crossed to the other side of the street. The look held no malice, yet it was enough to make Eli feel like a shadow in a city that had never made room for the lost. Exhaust from a bus turning into the street blew straight into his face, sending a sharp ache through his temple. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the memory rushing in. That smell of oil was identical to the one rising from the helicopter engine years ago, when it shuddered violently before plunging into the valley. All it took was a trace of it for his ears to fill again with twisting metal, and teammates shouting each other's names in panic. The memories merged into one heavy darkness, forcing him to brace a hand against the wall to keep his balance. He stood still for several seconds, palm pressed to the cold brick to pull himself back. His rough fingers scraped peeling paint, grounding him in the solid wall before him, anchoring him to the present. He exhaled slowly, white breath slipping out as if dissolving into the night. When he opened his eyes, the road ahead stretched long and empty. There was little traffic, only a few cars rushing past and vanishing around the bend. Night streets were sparse, but no more comforting than daytime ones. The cold made the whole city feel more distant, and Eli felt like part of its darkness. He adjusted the strap of his backpack. There was not much inside, just a few odds and ends to keep him from being empty-handed. Yet the rough strap in his grip reminded him he still had something to hold on to. A stronger gust forced him to lean aside as droplets from an awning shattered across the pavement. People said city winters cut deep, but for Eli, the cold carried memories as much as frost. Light from Hanover spilled yellow through the thin mist, forming a steady glow at the end of the street. Eli recognized it at once, the shooting range he had passed a few times before, not where he wanted to go, but one of the few places still lit at this hour, with enough warmth inside for him to stand and rest. He wanted nothing more than that, a place to stand, a few minutes to breathe without shivering. He watched Hanover for a moment, then moved on, each step marking a steady rhythm of soles against pavement, reminding him he still controlled his body and had to keep that rhythm, not let his mind drag him back into old dark places. The glass doors grew clearer as he approached. Inside was a bright, clean space under white lights over the firing lanes. Through the glass, she saw people talking, wearing protective headsets, some laughing after hitting a target. Their easy sounds felt foreign, as if he were looking into lives unburdened by heavy pasts. He raised a hand toward the door when the ventilation fan hissed sharply from the corner. His shoulders stiffened at once, reflex turning his head, eyes sweeping the dark behind him, finding only a lamppost and a damp wall. It took him a few seconds to relax his arms. He breathed slowly, drawing the cold air in and pushing it out in one long cycle. Since leaving the military, he had practiced this again and again, bit by bit, to keep himself from slipping into panic. He whispered, like a reminder, "Stand still for a moment." Eli stepped back half a pace, studying his reflection in the glass. The man staring back looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, hair down to his neck, a faded coat, and a faded layer of faith he once had. He barely recognized himself anymore. After years of living without knowing whether he was moving forward or drifting backward, a woman came out of Hanover, carrying a box of ammunition, the door opening just long enough for warmth to spill out. Eli shifted aside to clear her path. She glanced at him, surprised, said nothing, and the door closed again, sealing Hanover back into its separate pool of light. He stood there, shoes crushing the thin frost into small white patches, with each stamp, the sound helping keep his thoughts from going hollow. He needed to go inside, not to shoot or watch, just to get out of the wind. He took one more deep breath and reached out again, this time gripping the handle. The cool glass against his skin made him flinch, but he forced his hand to stay. As he pushed, the door gave slightly, opening a narrow gap for warmth to escape. At that instant, the dry, sharp sound of a gunshot carried from inside. The soundproof walls swallowed most of it, but even a fragment was enough to make his heart clamp tight. He froze half inside the doorway. Through the glass, a figure turned and looked straight toward the door where Eli stood, his hand locked on the handle, breath trapped in his chest. He did not know what the person inside had seen, but that gaze was fixed on him as if it had been waiting, and Eli crossed the threshold of Hanover the moment that gaze met his. When Eli stepped fully into Hanover, the warmth washed over his face like a thin blanket. The door closed behind him, cutting off the cold outside but not the echo of memories still tightening around his chest. The range was lit with white lights, shoes scraping the floor, metal clinking as guns were set down on tables, all blending into a hard, fractured rhythm. People came here to release tension, but for every sound placed him back beneath the helicopter blades from years ago. He stayed close to the wall on the right so as not to block anyone. The smell of gun oil from the cleaning counter dried his throat. He forced himself to breathe evenly, little by little, to keep his legs from shaking. A staff member passed him, nodded politely, then turned back to a group of customers laughing farther inside. At the center of the room, where people often gathered to watch skilled shooters perform, a young officer held a sleek black handgun. His military jacket hung open, sleeves rolled to reveal his forearms. Confidence showed clearly on his face, a bit excessive, as if the room's attention were his, by right. A few men nearby were talking about whether he could pull off another perfect string. As Eli searched for a quiet corner, a sudden shot rang out. It was not loud, but to Eli it tore straight into his chest. His shoulders twitched, lips pressing together, eyes snapping into alertness as if he had stepped into danger. The officer set the gun down, satisfaction plain on his face, turned to the crowd and said evenly, "See, that's what a clean shot looks like." Whistles and laughter followed. Chairs scraped closer, the noise swelling into something that made Eli feel stranded in a rhythm far from his own. He edged back until his shoulders touched the wall, hoping to blend into it and go unnoticed. But the officer had already seen him. The glance lasted only a second, yet Eli felt the shift immediately. It was not ordinary curiosity, but appraisal, probing, edged with undisguised irritation. The officer tilted his head and murmured to the man beside him, "You notice that guy? Doesn't look like a Hanover customer at all." The other man glanced over and replied quietly, "Probably wandered in. That coat says he's been on the street a while." The words were not loud, but every syllable reached Eli clearly. He pulled his hood lower and pressed himself closer to the wall, wanting to vanish. He did not want attention, did not want questions, only warmth and a few minutes for his heart to settle, nothing more. The officer did not let it go. Eli was not the kind of onlooker he was used to, not someone who fit his idea of an admiring audience. After a few more remarks to his group, he walked straight toward Eli. The sound of his shoes made Eli look up as the distance closed quickly. Mercer stopped in front of him, leaning slightly as if to get a better look. "What are you doing here?" One eyebrow lifted, voice low but loud enough to draw nearby eyes. Eli hesitated, uncomfortable with the directness, the sense of standing where he did not belong. Just getting out of the wind, he said quietly. Mercer looked him up and down with the expression reserved for someone out of place at a formal party. Getting out of the wind at a shooting range. The edge crept into his voice. This isn't a rest stop. Eli lowered his gaze. I'll stand for a bit and leave. A few soft laughs came from behind Mercer, not aimed at Eli but at the idea of him. Mercer's hand settled at his belt in a familiar display of authority. What's your name? Eli stared at the floor. I don't want to bother anyone. Mercer let out a short laugh. I didn't ask that. I asked your name. Eli's voice dropped further. I just want to stand still for a moment. Something in Eli's tone irritated Mercer. A man from the street who showed no fear, no flattery, no deference. It felt like a challenge even though Eli had done nothing. Mercer shifted his stance, braced one hand on a nearby table. Ian asked, Do you know who this place is for? Someone beside him chimed in with a snicker. Doesn't look like he knows how to use a gun. Eli said nothing, not from fear, but from refusal to let the exchange go further. He slowed his breathing, knowing that if his heart raced, the gunfire here would send his head spinning. Mercer studied him, then curled his mouth into an unfriendly smile, turned back toward the firing table where the gun still lay. His eyes flicked to it, then back to Eli as if an idea had formed. People nearby began paying closer attention, the noise around them thinning as curiosity spread. Someone whispered, Looks like Mercer's really on him. Mercer rested his hand on the gun, fingers tapping the metal as if testing its cold, his expression sharpening into something close to a dare. You standing there throws me off, he said lightly, control threaded beneath the humor, then looked straight at Eli. So, how about this? You show me what you can do. The room seemed to pause. Eli lifted his head slightly, confusion showing but not fear, and Mercer smiled. You came in to get out of the wind, right? But if you're going to stand around, you need to keep order. If you want to stay, you prove you're not here to cause trouble. People edged closer, silent, watching. Mercer held Eli's gaze. So, he said slowly, tell me this, what did you really come into? Hanover for Eli looked down at the cracked skin of his hands and answered on a thin breath. I need a place to stand for a few minutes. Mercer stepped closer. Then, be clearer. Were you watching me shoot, or are you looking for trouble? Eli did not step back. The lights blurred his vision slightly, but his voice held its fragile calm. I'm not looking for trouble. Mercer pressed his lips together, gaze dropping as if sealing an invisible line between them, then leaned in, eyes deliberately cold. Then, he said, What are you doing here? The atmosphere in the Hanover shooting range seemed to shift right after Mercer's last question. People nearby began glancing at Eli as if they were witnessing something uncommon. Eli stayed close to the wall, his shoulders slightly drawn in, not out of fear but because he was trying to keep his breathing steady. His hood shadowed part of his face, yet his expression still showed the exhaustion of someone who had endured more than an ordinary person should. Mercer stood in front of him, his eyes lit with barely concealed irritation. At first, they might have been merely curious, but the longer he looked at Eli, the more annoyed he became, as if Eli's silent presence itself were an invisible insult. Mercer shifted his stance, folded his arms, and asked in a patronizing tone, You lost or something? His voice was not loud, but it carried far enough for those nearby to hear. A few heads turned. Eli lowered his chin slightly, his voice thin but clear. I'm just staying out of the wind. Mercer let out a short, humorless laugh. Staying out of the wind by coming in here. Hanover isn't a place for you to loiter. Behind him, a few men laughed reflexively, not because the remark was funny, but because they caught the contempt in Mercer's voice and felt permitted to join in. Eli remained silent for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on an empty spot on the floor, as if he could exit the exchange by retreating inward. He did not want a confrontation, nor did he want to give Mercer the satisfaction of dominance. He had lived long enough among darkness and gunfire to know some battles were not worth entering. But Mercer did not stop. He tilted his head toward Eli and pressed on in a half-challenging tone. Ever held a gun? The question landed like a small needle, not painful, but sharp. Eli nodded faintly, eyes lowered. Yes, but a long time ago. Mercer frowned, his lips curling in disbelief. So long you forgot everything, he said lightly, with a thin blade hidden in each word. A few onlookers began exchanging glances, unsure why Mercer was focusing on Eli so intensely. Someone whispered to a friend, quiet enough not to reach Eli. To him, the only sound that mattered was the quickened beat in his chest. Despite his effort to keep it calm, Eli lifted his head slightly, not to meet Mercer's gaze but to reclaim his voice. I'm not bothering anyone, he said, each word slow, as if avoiding collision. The words were neither sharp nor pleading. They sounded like the last breath of patience he was trying to maintain. Mercer had no intention of stopping. In his eyes, Eli's silence was not composure, but provocation. He glanced around, then back at Eli, no longer hiding the murky pleasure growing in his look. The area nearby grew quieter. People at the adjacent table stopped talking and turned to watch, not because they expected drama, but because they knew Mercer enjoyed displaying his power, and this drifter had unwittingly become the perfect target. No one intervened, since most people came to Hanover to witness strength, not fairness. Mercer stepped back half a pace to study Eli more closely, his eyes sweeping over worn shoes, a creased old jacket, a faded backpack, all of it confirming a thought he had already formed. "You know," he said mockingly, "people come here to learn to shoot, to practice, or at least to know where they're supposed to stand. You're just standing there as you wander into a place you don't belong." Eli did not respond. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, as if trying to separate the sounds in this room from the noises in his memory. When he opened them, he said only one sentence, quiet enough to leave no echo. "I'll stand here a bit, then I'll go." Mercer laughed again, openly scornful this time. Turning to the group who had laughed with him earlier, he spoke loudly enough for Eli to hear. "He listens but doesn't understand a thing. I tell him to stand in the right place, and he thinks he gets to choose." Scattered laughter followed. Eli looked down, his hands curling slightly in response to the humiliation dripping word by word. Each remark from Mercer struck memories Eli tried to bury. The feeling of being judged, of being treated as a burden, as an extra shadow in a world with no place for him. Mercer seemed to think he had not yet shaken Eli enough. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to something intimate and venomous. "Honestly, did you come in here just to watch, out of curiosity, or because you forgot what you used to do out on the street?" This was no longer teasing. It was a direct stab at what Eli always tried to hide. For Mercer, such lines were games of control. For Eli, they opened a chasm he worked hard to avoid. He looked up, meeting Mercer's eyes for the first time, without defiance or fear, only the weariness of someone who had lived through too many winters inside himself. He did not answer. He did not need to. He drew in a slow breath and let it out softly, the way he always did when memory tightened around his chest. That reaction irritated Mercer further. He was not used to being ignored, especially by someone who looked so powerless. He straightened, jerked his chin toward the shooting table, fell silent for a few seconds while staring at Eli, then turned away as if a decision had taken shape. Everyone nearby followed his movement. Mercer walked to the shooting table and reached out to the gun resting there, his fingers gliding over the cold, polished metal as if weighing the next step. A subtle but unmistakable hush spread from that spot. Then his hand tightened slightly. He no longer looked at Eli, but the way his hand rested on the gun was enough to signal that this encounter was about to enter a completely different phase. And that was the moment when no one could predict what lay ahead. The air in the shooting range seemed to freeze the moment Mercer placed his hand on the gun. That single, small action was enough for everyone to sense what he was about to do. A few people seated closest stopped their half-finished conversations, turned their chairs, and watched. They did not know who Eli was, but they knew Mercer as the kind of man who only felt big when someone smaller was there to step on. In a place already full of noise, the silence among the onlookers stood out more sharply than anything else. Mercer spun the gun in his hand a few times, like a minor performance. He glanced sideways toward Eli, as if weighing his options, then said, in a deliberately casual tone, "Try one shot." His face showed little expression, but the slight lift of his eyebrow carried pressure. The people around waited, their eyes moving back and forth between Mercer and Eli like they were watching cards being turned face up one by one. Eli looked down at his hands before answering. He shook his head very slightly, his voice low and tired. "I'll stand here a bit, then I'll go." There was no resistance in the words, only a wish to withdraw. That softness irritated Mercer even more. He let out a shallow laugh, the smile of someone convinced he held complete control. "Just one shot," he said, with a hint of mockery. "No one will notice." That remark made a few people nearby hesitate. Mercer said, "No one will notice." Yet his tone pulled the entire room's attention straight to them. The stares gathered into an invisible ring that tightened by the second. Eli could feel it without looking up. The pressure was colder than the wind outside. The crowd grew so quiet that even the smallest movements could be heard. A man behind them murmured, "What's he trying to do?" Another replied, in an unreadable voice, "Probably trying to prove something." Some could not hide their anticipation. They wanted to see what would happen. They wanted to see the humiliation they assumed Eli would suffer. A few even leaned slightly for a better view. Mercer stepped closer and extended the gun toward Eli, an offer laced with violence but wrapped in the skin of a joke. He spoke slowly, clearly. "Hit the target. I apologize." He paused long enough for everyone to hear. Then he added, his eyes turning cold, "Miss, you know what that means." The words snapped shut like a trap in Eli's ears. He felt the weight of every gaze pressing into his back. Someone in the crowd whispered, trying to keep it low, but it still reached him. "Let him shoot." Another answered, "Look at him. How could he hit anything?" There was no deliberate cruelty in those comments, only the carelessness of bystanders, yet they tightened the cord, pulling Eli toward the place he most wanted to avoid. In that moment, Eli looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, from the cold, from hunger, and from something deeper he refused to name. Every time he looked at his hands, fragments of battlefield memory surged back. He had once held a gun with certainty, survived because of what these hands could do, but they had also carried him into his darkest days, where the echo of explosions never seemed to reach an end. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them very slowly, as if placing his body into a final state of endurance. At last, he let out a long breath, longer than usual, heavy with things suppressed for too long. "All right," he said, his voice neither sharp nor bitter, more like the worn acceptance of someone used to bearing weight. "Then I'll leave." The words carried far enough for the crowd to hear. A few people exchanged surprised looks. Others nodded slightly, as if this was what they had been waiting for. Mercer smiled in triumph. He brought the gun closer, and Eli took it with both hands, his movements slow and cautious, like touching something that had once belonged to him long ago but now felt distant. When Eli's hands closed around the grip, there was a subtle change Mercer failed to notice, though a few standing close felt it. It was not the clumsiness of someone who had never held a gun. It was as if Eli's body was remembering something his mind wished to forget. His thumb checked the safety without thinking, the motion too familiar to hide. Mercer stepped back half a pace, arms crossed. "Good," he said evenly, as if watching a performance that belonged to him. "I'll watch." No one spoke. A stretch of silence ran through the range like a taut wire, connecting the gun in Eli's hands to Mercer's stare. People nearly held their breath, not because they wanted to cheer anyone on, but because they wanted to see how this challenge would end. Eli stood a little straighter, though his shoulders still sagged with fatigue. He looked at the gun in his hands, a second longer than necessary. The smell of metal pulled him back to times when he never knew if he would be alive the next day. Mercer's laughter, the jeers, the casual mockery blended with the echoes of gunfire in his memory, forming a heavy layer of sound in his head. A question flickered through his mind, quick and faint. Why am I doing this? Another answer followed immediately, not from who he was now, but from who he had been years before. When survival was instinct, he felt his hands slowly regain their old steadiness, his body adjusting its breathing, not to impress anyone, but to keep himself from breaking. When Eli placed his hand on the support at the firing table, the room seemed to fall one level deeper into silence. No one knew that he was not trying to win, not trying to prove anything, only trying to keep his heartbeat from slipping off its course. He leaned forward slightly to set the gun at the correct angle. The weapon became a thin needle, stirring memories he had gathered and buried over 4 years since the helicopter crashed. He smelled gun oil mixed with smoke from that afternoon, a moment that made the air around him feel thick, almost suffocating. Mercer stood a few steps away, arms crossed, his eyes no longer mocking but eager to see Eli fail, unaware he was witnessing something far larger than an attempt to humiliate a drifter. Eli slid his back foot half a step behind, settling into a stance his body reclaimed on its own. He took one steady breath, preparing to face what was coming, even if it was only a small moment in this shooting range, and at the exact second Mercer lifted his brow in impatience. Eli looked through the sights. Every sound around him collapsed into a thin line, as a wire stretched tight between him and the target ahead. Mercer stood back, arms crossed, watching without blinking. Everything was about to slide into something no one in the room could imagine. No one in the room truly understood what was happening until Eli set his elbows on the firing table. The scattered noise that had lingered since Mercer's challenge had already begun to fade. But the moment Eli leaned in, bracing himself against the table's edge, the entire space sank into a deeper layer of stillness. A quiet no one demanded, yet everyone instinctively fell into. The ventilation fan still hummed. Someone had just dragged a chair with a faint scrape, but all of it was swallowed the instant the thin man in the faded jacket pressed the rifle stock into his shoulder. Eli did not rush. He did not move like someone unfamiliar or unsure. He went through each step with a strange, practiced ease, as if his body had once lived in this world for a long time and had only stepped away from it for a while. He drew the rifle in close, adjusted the barrel angle with small, precise motions. Every movement, purposeful, and without display. Only those who had seen a battlefield recognized that kind of control, and most people standing here had have never had it. Eli took a deep breath. Those closest heard it clearly, because it was not the breath of someone preparing to show off. It was the breath of someone trying not to drift back into memories he had spent years locking away. He closed his eyes for a single second, no longer, then opened them steady and clear, fixed on the target ahead. He no longer saw Mercer or anyone else in the room. Everything narrowed into a single line drawn from his eyes to the center of the target. The first shot rang out, clean and sharp, not overly loud but enough to startle those nearby because they had not expected him to fire so quickly. The target quivered. A few people craned their necks toward the electronic screen that marked the hit, then immediately looked at one another in disbelief. No one spoke, yet the shift in their expressions was louder than the gunshot itself. The second shot came faster than the first, as if his hand had found a rhythm his body had forgotten for years, and once touched, it snapped back into place, strong and exact. There was no hesitation in the trigger pull, no trace of showmanship, only the consistency of someone who had lived in places where a fraction of a second could cost his own life and the lives of those beside him. By now, the range was almost completely silent. Conversations were abandoned, and earlier laughter evaporated. People looked at each other, then at Eli, then back at the screen, as if needing confirmation again. A man standing near Mercer whispered in awe, "My God, he shoots like someone who's been trained." No one argued. They stayed still, waiting to see what would come next. The third shot was fired with a speed that barely left time to breathe. The sound struck the walls and echoed back. Yet instead of making the room louder, it cut into the silence, sharpening it, thickening it. Mercer's expression changed. The mocking smile vanished. He no longer stood with his arms confidently crossed. His hand dropped to his side, then rose again to fold across his chest, as if trying to steady something slipping inside him. He stopped watching the crowd and fixed his eyes on Eli, no longer with contempt, but with confusion edged by fear. The fourth shot followed on a simple breath. Eli's body did not tremble. He did not strain. Despite his worn clothes and the weight etched into his shoulders, he controlled the rifle like someone who had carried it through places no one ever wished to return to. The round landed before the onlookers could fully process it, and the gap between the fourth and fifth shots tightened around the room like a slowly drawn cord. A woman near the door covered her mouth, eyes wide. A young man pressed his lips together and whispered, barely audible, "That's impossible. There's no way a homeless man shoots like this." Mercer heard it clearly, his face draining of color. Minutes ago, he had been certain he would humiliate Eli. Now he was the one pulled into the weight of this moment. Eli adjusted his shoulder, a movement so slight yet clear to those with experience that he was preparing to finish. He did not look around, did not notice Mercer frozen in place, did not acknowledge the eyes fixed on him. He poured everything into the target ahead, as if it were the final point, anchoring him to the rest of the world. The fifth shot rang out. It sounded heavier than the previous four, though the force was no stronger. It was like the sound of a door closing from the inside. The shell casing clattered across the floor, struck the metal at the end of the lane, and came to rest, just as everyone held their breath. No one applauded. No one broke the air with a joke. They stood still because something in the moment made any other reaction feel impossible. Eli set the gun down, his movement so gentle it seemed detached from what he had just done. He did not turn to check the result, did not look at Mercer, did not look at the crowd, staring in shock. He did not need their reaction. He straightened slowly and steadily, each motion measured to keep his body grounded. He gathered his breath, placed a hand on the edge of the firing table, and stood fully upright. He said nothing. That silence carried more weight than laughter or a returned challenge. It was the silence of someone who had fought long enough to no longer need to prove anything. Across the room, Mercer stared at him, eyes wide, lips trembling as if trying to form words that would not come. A man who had always used words as weapons was now paralyzed by Eli's quiet. A few people turned to look at Mercer, their eyes asking questions he could not answer. The laughter once aimed at Eli was gone, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement. When Eli stepped back from the firing table, no one stopped him, and no one approached. Every gaze followed his steps. Someone inhaled deeply, as if they had just witnessed something beyond their understanding. Someone else looked again at the results screen, unable to believe the 5 impacts aligned in near-perfect order. Mercer stood there, hands unconsciously clenched, while Eli turned away and adjusted the strap of his backpack. He walked through the absolute silence of a room once known as the loudest place in the city, leaving behind 5 bullet holes in a straight line, like a mark drawn from the past, through the present, and sliding into a future no one could predict. Eli set the gun down without looking at anyone, and when the door behind him opened softly, the room still had not taken its breath back. A story was opening, and if you want to continue this journey with Eli, follow the channel so you do not miss the next part. The room was still dense after the 5 shots, the air almost tangible. Mercer stood frozen at the firing table while Eli stepped back, adjusting his backpack strap as if he wanted to leave as fast as possible. He dipped his head slightly, a gesture that closed what had just happened, and said loud enough to be heard, "I'm done. I'm leaving." There was no pride in it, no challenge. He sounded like someone who had finished something he never wanted to do, but had to avoid something worse. He turned toward the door and took 2 steps when Mercer's voice burst out, slightly trembling, like a man realizing something he did not want to believe. "Wait, who are you?" It was a simple question, yet it landed in the room like heavy metal striking the floor. The people around, many still stunned, immediately turned to look at Eli. They no longer saw him as the man who had fired 5 perfect shots, but as a mystery slipping free of its mask. They did not know how to place him. A homeless man ducking in from the cold, a professional sniper burning through the last of his luck, or someone hollowed out by time and war, until nothing remained but survival reflexes. Eli did not answer right away. He hitched the backpack strap higher so the weight settled on one shoulder, easing the strain. That small movement alone showed how tired he was. Finally, after a long breath, he said, "I don't want trouble." He did not turn back, his voice blending with the cold air coming through the open door. A few people whispered something, then fell silent again, as if afraid of breaking the fragile balance hanging over the room. Mercer swallowed and took a step toward him. His face was still flushed from the humiliation, but in his eyes was something no longer arrogant, more the bitterness of a man whose shallowness had been exposed in front of a crowd. "I'm serious," he said slowly. "What's your name? At least tell me that." The room stayed quiet enough to hear the rustle of someone's jacket. The onlookers, who moments earlier had treated Eli like a nobody, now felt as if they were standing in a shared test. They waited for his answer the way one waits for a door to crack open, to learn what kind of man had just silenced them all, where he came from, how he had lived. Eli stopped. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if that question weighed more than the 5 shots he had just fired. He stood still for a few seconds, drew in a long breath to keep his voice steady, then turned his head just enough to reveal his features without fully facing them. "My name stopped mattering a long time ago," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. The range fell another level deeper into silence. No one fully understood what he meant, but everyone felt it came from somewhere very deep and very dark. It was not modesty or a refusal to be known. It was abandonment, a letting go that had lasted far too long. Eli did not explain further. He did not need to correct anyone's thoughts. Mercer stood stunned. He opened his mouth as if to ask more, then stopped, because there was nothing that could follow what he had just heard. He looked at Eli like someone staring at a figure that would shatter if touched. The arrogance he had worn minutes earlier vanished completely, replaced by confusion and embarrassment. The man who thought he held control was now laid bare by someone who had done nothing except exist. Eli turned fully toward the door. His hand unconsciously straightened his crooked collar, a small gesture heavy with the weariness of someone who had carried too much. He walked slowly, but steadily, like someone leaving a place he never belonged. His footsteps rang clearly, each one underlining a story no one had yet understood. Behind him, a few murmurs rose, then died as he neared the door. A man by the firing lane whispered, "Who was that?" Another answered more quietly, "I don't know, but he shot like someone who's lived with guns his whole life." There was no scorn in it, only an unwilling acknowledgement of something they could not explain. Mercer made one last attempt to hold on to control. "Did you hear me?" he called out, his voice higher now, afraid of being left behind completely. "You can't just walk away like this." Eli did not turn around. "I already said it," he replied clearly. "I don't want to bother anyone anymore." The words ended the exchange like a period, not out of anger, but because he was too exhausted to remain in the same space as other people's curiosity. No one in the room knew that. They only saw a man walking away, his eyes no longer strong enough to look back. He placed his hand on the door. The cold metal numbed his fingertips. He pushed it open, letting the outside wind pass through him. The sudden chill sharpened his senses, reminding him how close he had come to an emotional edge. He stepped through without hesitation. At that moment, behind him, there was a small sound. A phone hidden behind someone's sleeve was still still recording. A red light blinked faintly in the shadows at the back of the room, where the overhead lights did not reach. Its owner had not spoken all along, standing in a corner, filming from the moment Mercer began mocking Eli. The camera still aimed at his back. No one else noticed, but that tiny light carried a bad feeling. What had been recorded no longer belonged only to those present. It was about to move outside, into a space that could not be controlled, where the story would be retold in someone else's voice, and bent to someone else's will. Eli did not know there were eyes behind him holding on to his image. He stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. Inside the room, the red light blinked once more before the hand holding the phone lowered. A single tap was enough to turn the man who did not want a name into the center of a story he never chose, and everything was about to turn in a direction no one in that room could imagine. The evening passed faster than Eli expected. The wind lashed back into his face as he stepped out of Hanover, stinging his eyes. He pulled his hood lower, trying to hide himself among the stream of people moving along the sidewalk. He believed what happened in the shooting range would fade quickly, like gun smoke dissolving into the air, that Mercer and everyone else would soon forget a nameless homeless man. He did not know that behind that door, the red light on a phone had captured everything. By the time hands in places he had never set foot in began passing that video to one another, the story had already slipped beyond his reach. At a small diner tucked into a row of buildings on the east side, two middle-aged men sat waiting for their food. One opened his phone, tapped the screen, then turned to his friend. His voice was slow, tinged with curiosity and surprise. "Look at this. 5 shots in a row. Not off by a hair." He slid the phone across the table. "I thought scenes like this only happened in special forces units." The other man watched longer than usual, then frowned. "Who is he? He doesn't look like someone with the means to train like that," he added more quietly. "There's something strange in his eyes." Within minutes, the video was shared with the table beside them. Within hours, it appeared across social media groups. Headlines popped up in every tone imaginable: amusement, doubt, even mockery. Comments poured in non-stop, like rain. "I don't buy it. A homeless guy can't shoot like that. He was probably a soldier. You can tell by the trigger pull. His eyes are scary. What has someone been through to shoot like that?" While thousands of people dissected every frame, Eli kept walking, like someone drifting through cold water. He descended the steps into the subway station, looking for a corner to sit and rest. The station was louder than usual, steel wheels grinding on rails mixed with announcement speakers, turning the space into a blur of noise. He found a sheltered spot near a stone pillar, sat down, and clasped his hands together to hold onto a bit of warmth. A young couple passed by. The girl held her phone, eyes fixed on the screen. The boy glanced over and said, "That guy who fired 5 shots, do you think he was showing off to get attention?" She shook her head. "No, he looks more sad than desperate to be seen." They walked on, leaving Eli sitting still. Without looking up, he knew they were talking about the video. A tight feeling crossed his chest. He pulled his hood lower, as if trying to fold himself into the shadows. Elsewhere in the city, the one person who did not focus on the shooting technique, but on what lay behind it, was Major Emma Rowan. She worked at the Riverside Veterans Center, where people who had been through war came carrying wounds in their minds and hearts. When the video appeared in her recommended feed, she intended to watch only a few seconds. But after the first shot, Emma leaned back in her chair, frowned, and replayed the moment Eli drew his breath, adjusted his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger like someone fighting himself more than aiming at a target. He flinched at the sound. She murmured in her quiet office. The backpack pressed close, like a grounding object. She zoomed in frame by frame, his shoulders tense after each release. His heart rate must be racing. The signs of post-traumatic stress are unmistakable. Emma set the phone down and leaned back. Others watched the video for shock value. She saw a hidden cry for help in every movement. She did not know the man's name, but she knew the kind of silence he was using to stay upright. That day, she left the center earlier than usual. Knocking on the door at Hanover, she spoke with the range manager. "Have you seen this man?" She showed the screen to the middle-aged man wiping down the counter. Tall, thin, long hair, worn jacket. The manager studied it, then nodded. "Yes, someone like that was here yesterday. He didn't look well." Emma asked a few more questions, then followed the directions she was given. She walked through crowded streets, crossed a short bridge leading to an old parking lot, then down a road toward a secondary station area, where yellow lights spilled onto cold concrete. Near the overpass, she she saw a figure sitting close to a concrete wall. Eli had drawn his legs in, hands tucked inside his jacket to keep warm. His head was lowered, as if trying to hide even from his own breathing. Emma slowed her steps. When she stopped a few paces away, he looked up on instinct, wary. She did not move closer, did not rush into advice. "My name is Emma," she said, her voice low and steady. "I work at the Riverside Veterans Center. I saw the video yesterday." Eli did not answer. His gaze shifted to the road behind her, searching for an exit, sensing he might stand up and leave. Emma softened her tone. "I'm not here to bother you. I came because I've seen people like you before. Your shoulders tighten after every shot. Your breathing falls out of rhythm in a way I know well." She let silence settle, giving him space to breathe. Eli turned his face slightly away. He was used to being looked at differently, but Emma's gaze was not curiosity or judgment. It was the look of someone recognizing something she understood too deeply. "Do you have somewhere to rest tonight?" she asked. Eli slowly shook his head, not asking for anything, only avoiding words he was not ready to open. Emma continued, "There's always an empty room where I work. If you want, I can take you there. No questions." Eli stayed quiet. Distant traffic echoed. Wind threaded through the gap under the bridge, humming softly. In the darkness between the concrete pillars, he sensed her words were not the kind of pity he had known. Part of him wanted to speak, to explain, or refuse, but the words stuck in his throat. Emma lowered herself to his level, careful not to intrude. "If you don't have the strength to keep going, my place always keeps the lights on. You can rest there," she said. A simple sentence, gentle enough to reach the deepest layer of exhaustion. Eli bowed his head, his shoulders slowly easing, as if the jacket he wore had grown a little lighter. He did not answer, but Emma noticed his breath deepen, and his eyes stopped scanning for an escape, settling instead on the wall by his feet. A small sign, but the first time he allowed himself not to spring up and leave. At last, Eli spoke quietly. "Let me sit a bit longer." Not a refusal, not an agreement. Just the first time in many years, he reclaimed a moment of stillness for himself, and in this noisy corner of the city, that stillness was the door opening to whatever came next, something he never expected to step into. The brief meeting beneath the overpass ended without any clear answers. Eli stayed where he was, eyes lowered to the stained concrete, while Emma stood up, gave him a small nod, then stepped back a few paces. She did not push him to decide anything. She only placed a business card beside the edge of his backpack. "If there's a moment when you feel like you can't hold on anymore," she said, "come by. I'm always at the center until evening." After that, she left, slowly, as if afraid her footsteps might make him change his mind. Eli picked up the card, looked it over once, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. His eyes followed Emma's figure as it faded into the distance, but his mind was dragged back to gunshots, harsh light, and the many eyes fixed on him that day at Hanover. The feeling of being boxed in by whispers clung to him through the rest of the evening. He stood up and walked along a row of old buildings toward a quiet stretch of street. He did not know what he was looking for, except a place to curl up and wait for the night to pass. Cold wind cut at his neck as Eli stepped under the awning of a closed shop. He spread his old jacket on the ground, set his backpack down as a pillow. It had been a long time since he slept anywhere other than corners like this, so lying on cold pavement did not trouble him any further. What kept him uneasy was the sense of being watched, even though he knew no one was there. His eyes closed little by little, his breathing slowing, until sleep pulled him under. But the darkness carried the image of a distant night, where helicopter blades tore through the air and the sky burned red with fire. In the dream, Eli was back inside the rattling metal shell. Teammates laughed as the aircraft flew into the mission zone. One voice said, "Hey Eli, after this one, you should leave the unit. You're worn out." Another clapped his shoulder. "Don't listen to him. You're still the sharpest shot we've got." Then the explosion threw them apart. Fire flooded the cabin. Smoke and fuel burned his lungs. His eyes stung. He shouted names, but his voice vanished into screaming wind and tearing metal. In the dream, his hands kept pulling at a door that never opened. A familiar voice rose behind him, calm amid the chaos. "Eli, you don't have to live like this." It belonged not to the living, but to someone he had lost. He wanted to turn, but his body in the dream was frozen. The voice came again, close enough to feel at his ear. "Enough, Eli." He jolted awake, as if yanked to the surface. His chest heaved, breath breaking apart, cold sweat running down his spine. Distant traffic in the present night could not drown out the echo of helicopter blades still roaring in his head. He raised a hand to his face, but it trembled, so he only brushed his skin and let it fall to his thigh. He looked around. No fire, no shouting, just an empty street and his own breathing. Eli cupped his hands near his mouth to keep warm, forcing his heart to slow. He told himself, without words, I'm still here. It did not erase the fear, but it kept him from being pulled back into memory. When he lay down again, he felt something pressing beneath him. He pulled the business card from his pocket. It was creased, but the words were clear. Emma Rowan, Riverside Veterans Center. Only a few lines of text, yet they felt like a thin strip of light inside a dark room. He stared at it long enough that the night's cold no longer numbed his fingers. He read Emma's name again and again, then flipped the card over. On the back, she had written a short line in ink. If you want to start again, I'm there. No promises, no demands, just a narrow path left open for him to step into. Eli held the card in his palm, as if it were something fragile. A thought formed, hesitant but clear. He could not keep living like this. Every night felt like a battle with no exit, and he knew his strength was running out. The nightmares were not just dreams, they were chains, holding him between being alive and something else in between. He sat there for a long time, waiting for the shaking to ease. It was late. A drizzle began tapping against the awning above him, steady drops that sounded like a quiet urging. Eli pulled his backpack close, drew in a long breath, then spoke out loud, forcing himself to hear it. All right, I'll try. He stood up, shoulders tilting under the sudden cold, and stepped out from beneath the awning. The wet road reflected pale yellow streetlights. He passed shuttered shops, an old bus stop, and stretches of sidewalk where he had spent many nights before. Each step felt like it was separating him from an older version of himself. When the sun was nothing more than a thin gray glow behind the clouds, he stopped in front of the Riverside Veterans Center. The building was not large, but the light at its entrance was brighter than the rest of the street. The glass door reflected his image, a thin man with a long beard, shoulders bent by years of drifting. Eli studied the reflection and realized he had not really looked at himself in a long time. He raised a hand and brushed his beard, feeling the rough hair under his fingers. He placed his hand on the door handle. Warmth from inside seeped through the metal, enough to steady his shaking fingers. A thought passed through him: if he turned away now, everything would return to how it was, and that meant he would not survive many more nights. Eli tightened his grip and pulled. The space inside was brighter than he expected, the faint smell of fresh coffee hanging in the reception area, and at the table facing the front desk, Emma was sitting there, as if she had known the moment he would walk in. She looked up as soon as the door made a soft sound. Their eyes met. There was no surprise, no rush of questions, only a very small nod from Emma, like a simple sentence saying, "I'm here," and Eli, for the first time in many years, did not turn his back and walk away. Eli stood outside the therapy room door for a long time that morning before lifting his hand and knocking softly. Inside, Emma's voice carried out, calm and steady, the same tone he had heard in passing through the hallway before. When he pushed the door open, she looked up and gestured to the chair across from her. "Have a seat," she said. No pressure, no rapid questions, no look reserved for a difficult case. The way she approached him eased some of the tension in his body, though his shoulders still drew in slightly, a habit he could not shake. The first session was filled more with silence than words. Emma asked a few gentle questions, the kind meant to open a path rather than extract information. "How's your sleep?" Eli answered briefly. "Short." After a moment, she asked, "How does your body react to loud noises?" He said, "I flinch." Just that. 2 sentences, but Emma nodded as if those 2 answers were enough to mark a starting point. She placed a small card in front of him with a few breathing instructions. "Try this every day, just a few times," she said. Eli looked at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his jacket pocket, as if it were something unfamiliar. He left the room when the rain had just stopped, walking more slowly than usual. A strange feeling settled in his chest, the feeling of someone who had stayed in one place without hiding from the wind or from people. In the days that followed, Eli came back regularly. He still spoke little, usually answering in short phrases, but Emma noticed that each time he walked into the room, his breathing came a little easier than before. Gradually, he learned to recognize when panic surged. "When your chest tightens, don't push through it," Emma told him. "Pause for a beat, find something solid around you, then breathe." At first, Eli struggled, his breath breaking unevenly, but after a few weeks, he could close his eyes for a few seconds without being dragged back into memory. In the evenings, he carried an old radio he had taken from the center's donated supplies. It crackled with static, but he liked the sound. It made him feel like he belonged in a room with dim yellow light, instead of on a cold sidewalk with noises that stole his sleep. Some nights, he left the radio on until near dawn, then drifted off to sleep with distorted old music playing. One afternoon, Emma called him into her office. She held the center's activity schedule in her hand. The firearm safety area is short-staffed, she said. They need someone with experience to explain basic procedures. No shooting, no advanced training, just standing there and explaining the process. Eli listened and stayed quiet for a moment. The word firearm made his hands tighten. Emma noticed and slowed her voice. I don't want to put you in a hard position, but I think you can handle this. Eli let out a very soft breath. If it's instruction, he said, I can do it. I won't shoot. The words made Emma tilt her head slightly, not in surprise, but because she sensed it was a small milestone for him. On his first day of teaching, Eli was a little awkward. The group of young recruits looked at him with curiosity. One of them asked, Where did you serve? Eli answered briefly, Air Reconnaissance Unit. The looks shifted instantly from curiosity to respect. Another asked, What kind of weapon did you use the most? Eli shook his head, avoiding detail. Every type has strengths and risks. Here, you learn the important things first. No one in the room knew he had once been the top marksman in his team, and Eli did not want them to know. He did not build a reputation. He only taught how to hold a weapon properly, how to check the chamber, and how to place a finger on the trigger. When a recruit made a mistake, Eli placed a hand lightly on the young man's shoulder and said, Slow down, do it again. His voice was low and calm, without intimidation. When the session ended, a few people thanked him and left. Eli stayed behind, quietly straightening the table. He looked at the dummy rounds used for training, feeling as if he were standing at a safe distance from a bridge leading back to the past. He did not cross it. He stayed at the edge. That afternoon, he sat alone by the window in the break room. The late sunlight filtered through thin glass and fell across the old radio he had brought with him. A vintage song played softly, the drawn-out notes just enough to steady his heartbeat. For the first time in months, Eli felt a small sense of calm, not complete comfort, but the ability to breathe deeply without fear of being trapped in memory. Emma passed by and saw him sitting quietly, his face less tight than before. You okay? She asked. Eli did not answer right away, but his expression softened slightly. I'm getting used to it, he said. Not good yet, but much better. Emma nodded and said nothing more, leaving him in that rare moment of stillness. That evening, Eli walked around the center grounds. He was getting used to being in a space with people moving around without feeling pushed into a corner. Laughter from the common room, running water in the kitchen, doors opening and closing, all blended into an ordinary rhythm of life. Sometimes, someone greeted him, and he nodded back. That nod meant more to him than long conversations. The next day, while guiding a new group of recruits and explaining safe distances on the range, a sharp sensation flared at his temple and made him pause. His vision blurred briefly, then cleared. He placed a hand on his abdomen and followed the breathing exercise Emma had taught him. Only a few seconds, but enough to keep him from being swept away. A recruit noticed him step back slightly and asked, You tired? Eli shook his head. I'm okay. Let's continue. The sensation lingered under his skin. That afternoon, he took the radio outside to the yard behind the center, where a row of wooden benches lined the planters. The air was still, so the music carried more clearly than usual. Eli closed his eyes for a few seconds and let his head relax. When he opened them, the sky was already darkening. He realized he had come a long way since the night he slept under the awning. He did not know where he was headed, but he knew he was moving, one step at a time. Just as he was about to stand and head back inside, a sound brushed his hearing. A faint thup, thup, from above, very soft, but enough to send a chill up his spine. He tilted his head and looked at the sky. In the distance, the lights of a training helicopter were approaching, the sound rippling across rooftops and dropping into the yard where Eli stood. He froze, his heart racing out of rhythm. Cold spread from his chest down into his stomach, followed by an uncontrollable tremor. Eli's eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat. The small yard around him vanished, leaving only the rotor blades grinding into his memory like a twisting blade. He stepped back once, then again, but his legs began to stiffen. His eyes locked open, unblinking, and the sound was still coming closer. The helicopter sound kept drilling into the air like an invisible bit. Each dull thup-thup slammed down and stripped Eli of his footing. He stood in the backyard of the Veterans Center, one trembling hand pressed against the wooden table, his breathing speeding up with every echo bouncing off the metal roof. The sky above seemed to split open, throwing him back to a moment 4 years earlier, when a helicopter wobbled and plunged straight into a valley. The faces of his teammates, the shouted names swallowed by the wind, all crashed back in a single instant. His legs began to give. Eli reached for the wall, but there was not enough strength. As the helicopter noise seemed to drop right overhead, he collapsed to his knees, his body folding in on itself, his chest locked tight, his breath stuck in his throat. Stop, he tried to tell himself, but his lips only moved without sound. Fear took him down exactly as the therapy team had warned. Memory does not need an invitation. It opens the door on its own. A recruit leaving the training room heard a light thud and turned back. He saw Eli lying on his side on the ground, both hands clamped over his head, eyes wide, as if staring at something that did not belong in this place. "Is anyone here?" the recruit shouted, then ran inside. "Call a doctor, now." His voice echoed down the hallway and pulled everyone's attention. Emma, reviewing files in a nearby room, ran out immediately. When she reached him, Eli was curled in on himself like someone about to be dragged down from a great height. She knelt beside him and lowered her voice to cut through the helicopter sound as it began to move away. "Eli, I'm here," she said, not touching him yet, letting her voice guide him back. "Look at me, slowly. Hear me." Eli tried to turn toward the familiar sound. His eyes caught only a blur, but Emma's voice was enough to ease the grip in his body. "Breathe," she said calmly. "Send it down into your stomach. That's it." She held her hand out, suspended between them. "You don't have to take it. Just know my hand is here." Little by little, Eli's breathing returned. The helicopter had moved farther away, the noise fading. Others kept their distance so they would not startle him. By the time the doctor arrived, Emma had helped Eli sit up with his back against the wall. Sweat along his neck felt icy, his old shirt clinging to his skin. The doctor checked his pulse, then looked at Emma. Not a severe relapse, just memory hitting fast. The word hitting made Eli close his eyes briefly, because it fit exactly what he had felt. The doctor gave his shoulder a light pat. "You didn't fail, Eli. Your body reacted the way it learned to. What matters is that you brought yourself back." Eli nodded, his throat still tight. When everyone else left, Emma sat beside him on the step. She let him sit in silence for a few minutes, then asked, "Do you want to lie down or go outside?" Eli looked at his hands, still shaking. "I want to walk a bit," he said quietly. "Not far." It was dark when Eli stepped onto the road in front of the center. A drizzle fell, enough to dampen his hair and soak into his collar. He did not cover his head, letting the cold drops hit his face and pull him into the present. He walked slowly, his hands clenching and releasing in rhythm, forcing his focus onto his steps instead of the images that had surged back. At the end of the street, he stopped beneath a yellow streetlight. The glow stretched across the wet pavement. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something he had carried for 4 years, an empty cartridge, old, slightly dented at the tip. He had kept it as a reminder, proof of the moment his team went down in the field. Every time he touched it, the weight returned. Now, standing in the rain, he turned the cartridge in his palm, the cold metal pressing into his skin. Eli opened his hand and looked at it resting there, small, yet holding a whole part of his life. Rain pooled in his palm, giving the metal a dull sheen. "Enough," he whispered, and dropped it into the trash can beside him. The sound of metal hitting the bottom rang sharp and hollow in the empty street. No one saw it, but Eli knew it was the first decision he had made for himself in years, instead of living on reflex alone. When he returned to the center, most of the hallway lights were off, and only a dim glow came from the duty room. Emma saw him come in, his clothes wet, hair stuck to his forehead. She did not ask why he had walked in the rain. She simply handed him a dry towel. Eli wiped his face and sat down in a chair in the break room. His hands rested on his thighs as he let out a long breath. The dizziness had faded, replaced by a deep, clear exhaustion. The next morning, Eli knocked on Emma's office door. She looked up as he stood in the doorway. "How are you?" she asked. Eli sat down, placed both hands on the desk, not hiding his fatigue, but his eyes were steadier than the night before. "Last night," he said, "I thought I was done for." Emma nodded, letting him continue. "But," Eli touched his jacket pocket, where the cartridge was no longer there. "I think I want to keep trying." Emma exhaled softly, as if releasing a worry she had been holding. "You've already come a long way. There's more ahead, but you're not walking it alone." Eli looked down at the desk, then gave a small nod. A few quiet minutes passed. When Emma opened her schedule, she said, "Tomorrow the center is hosting a group of kids who've experienced domestic violence. They want to learn some basic skills to feel more confident. I think you could guide them on safety." Eli lifted his head slightly, surprised. He started to refuse out of habit, but Emma continued, "No shooting, just talking." showing a few simple procedures so they feel stronger. Eli fell silent. He remembered the young recruits, remembered moments when he had helped them steady their movements, not happy memories, but moments when he did not feel useless. "What do you think?" Emma asked again. Eli looked out the window toward the yard where yesterday's panic had struck. The night rain had washed the ground clean, leaving the surface faintly bright. He watched it for several seconds, then his shoulders eased, his gaze softened. At that exact moment, he was about to give his answer. That afternoon, the Veterans Center filled with the sound of children's laughter for the first time after days of quiet. A group of teenagers arrived for a support program for kids who had witnessed domestic violence. The way they entered the room said a lot. Some lifted their chins, trying to look tougher than their age. Some hid behind friends, and others moved quickly, as if hoping to shrink away from unfamiliar eyes. Eli stood by the window, watching with slow, careful attention. He was not used to noise, yet the presence of the children changed the air in the room, lighter somehow, almost enough to make his shoulders loosen. One of them caught Eli's eye, a thin boy with large eyes, holding a sketchbook, while the others talked. The boy found a corner of the table and began to draw. Eli walked over, his steps quiet, so he would not startle him. When he reached the table, he bent slightly to look at the page. It showed a soldier shielding a child behind him, smoke and fire filling the background. The drawing was not perfect, but every line was honest. An honesty Eli recognized at once. He knelt to bring himself level with the boy. "Are you drawing someone?" he asked, his voice low, unhurried, without pressure. The boy looked up. Eli saw caution in his eyes, but not fear, the kind of guardedness only children who have been hurt carry. "A soldier," the boy said, soft but clear, really strong, not afraid of anything. Eli studied the drawing a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "Looks like he's protecting someone." The boy pressed his lips together. "I think anyone strong is like that. They don't back away." Eli did not smile, but his eyes softened. "Adults get scared too," he said gently, like stating something obvious. "Not everyone says it out loud." The boy lifted his head a little more, as if testing whether the words were true. "Are you scared of loud noises?" The question came out direct and innocent, unaware of where it landed. Eli did not dodge it. "Yes," he said honestly, "but I'm practicing, not letting it control me anymore." He glanced back at the drawing and added, "Like you, practicing to draw more clearly, a little better each time." The boy nodded and said nothing more, but Eli saw a small spark of understanding in his eyes, thin as a thread, yet enough to link two people from very different worlds. Eli stood up, something stirring in his chest that he had not touched in a long time, a sense of meaning, not grand, not shining, just the feeling that he could still be useful. Emma stood near the door, watching the scene from a distance. Her arms were folded, her head slightly tilted, her expression soft, almost smiling without quite smiling. When Eli came back, she asked, "How does it feel?" "Calm," Eli answered. The word was simple, but there was something in his voice Emma had not heard before, a quiet that did not come from hiding, but from touching the right place. The children were split into small groups to talk with volunteers. A young woman guiding one group turned to Emma and asked, "Next week, we want to take the kids to Hanover, just to see how serious training environments work. Do you have anyone who could lead them?" She glanced at Eli and added, "It would be great if he came along. Kids respect people who've served." Eli heard the comment clearly but did not respond right away. Hanover was not a neutral place for him. It was where the chaos of recent months had begun, where he fired 5 shots, where Mercer's stare dragged his past into the open, where he was once again placed in front of a crowd. He did not hate Hanover. He had just never returned to it without armor. Emma looked at him. "You can say no," she said quietly. "No one's forcing you." Eli sat down on the wooden bench by the wall. Children's laughter continued around the room, mixed with the scratch of pencils and the soft shuffle of shoes. He watched them, then thought of Hanover, then of the battlefield. Memories rolling in gentle layers. He thought of the boy who had asked if he was afraid of loud noises, and of the way the boy's eyes had brightened when he learned that adults try every day too. Emma pulled a chair closer. "You're still taking steps, Eli. Some steps are bigger than others, but they all matter." Eli rested his hands on his knees and breathed deeply. After a long pause, he said, "If I take them, I'd have to stand in Hanover, right?" "Yes," Emma replied, "but you'd be there in a different role, not the one being tested, not the one being stared at. You'd be there as a guide." In that moment, Eli looked up. His eyes were not bright or fierce, but there was a calm resolve in them. He understood he had avoided Hanover because of memory, but avoiding it forever was not healing, and he wanted to help those kids, even if it was only by standing beside them for one afternoon. His shoulders lowered slightly. enough for Emma to know the answer was forming. A volunteer came over to ask Emma about the schedule. When she turned back, Eli was still seated, looking out the window where the gray sky was easing into late afternoon light. He drew a steady breath, his chest heavy but stable, and finally spoke. He looked at Emma, his voice low but clear. "All right, I'll lead them." And when he said it, Emma's face relaxed into a small, proud smile. As if both of them knew this was a milestone Eli had to reach on his own. That morning, Eli woke earlier than usual. He stood in front of the small mirror in the center room, its surface scratched and worn, but still clear enough to reflect his eyes. The dark circles beneath them, traces of long nights, were less deep than they had been months before. He washed his face with cold water, moving slowly, then put on his jacket. His hand paused at the collar for a few seconds, as if his body were checking whether it was steady enough to step back into a place that had once tightened his chest to the point of choking. In the common room, the kids were gathering, the soft slap of sandals running across the floor, a few teasing each other, a few hugging their backpacks to their chests. When they noticed Eli, the noise softened, curious eyes lifting toward him. The youngest girl stepped closer and gently tugged at the edge of his jacket. "Is Hanover big?" she asked. Eli answered, "Not very big," and she smiled, as if that alone was enough to reassure her. Emma handed him the list of stops and gave a small nod. "If anything feels off, it's okay to step outside for a few minutes," she said. He took the paper and slipped it into his pocket, not answering right away. A moment later, Eli said, "I'll be okay." His voice, not strong, but steady. The center van stopped in front of Hanover around 10 in the morning. The sky was gray enough that the light fell in muted patches. When the kids climbed down, they chirped like young birds, craning their necks to look at the faded metal sign of Hanover. Eli stood last, his hand resting on the van door for a few seconds before letting go. He took a breath, then stepped down onto the cold ground. The entrance to Hanover looked the same as the day he had walked in months earlier. The handle was cold enough to numb his knuckles slightly. Eli placed his hand on it and hesitated, exactly as his memory warned him he would. For a brief second, he heard the echo of old gunshots in his head, but he did not pull his hand away. He opened the door. The metal sound rang evenly through the space, like a reflection of the past. The kids streamed in behind him, footsteps lively. A boy asked, "Do people really practice shooting here?" Eli nodded. "Yes, but today, you don't need to shoot anything." The long room stretched out before them, rows of firing tables evenly spaced. The smell of gun oil was fainter than the last time Eli had been there, but still sharp enough to prick at the back of his neck. He walked slowly down the aisle. The kids followed in a loose line, listening to his explanations while whispering among themselves. Eli stopped at firing table number 3. It was the table where he had once lain down, gun in hand, 5 shots that had silenced the room. As he stepped closer, his heart sped up slightly, an old rhythm resurfacing. He placed his hand on the tabletop, fingertips touching the cold wood. A boy nearby asked, "Have you shot here before?" Eli looked down at the table for another second, then answered, "Yes." The boy pressed on, curious. "Are you still really good at it?" Eli shook his head lightly. Being good or not isn't what matters anymore. An instructor brought over a demonstration firearm for the kids to observe the safety mechanisms. By habit, he placed it on the table in front of Eli. Eli looked at it, not fear exactly, but the caution of someone who had held too many guns in his life. He rested his hand on the table and spoke loud enough for the kids to hear. "Today, you only need to understand how people keep each other safe. No one needs to touch this." He stepped back half a pace, a clean, deliberate movement, like choosing where to stand so he could stay grounded. One child asked, "So what are you teaching us?" Eli answered, "How to stand upright when you're scared, how to choose what you can do, instead of being pulled along by what scares you." The kids nodded. A few of them looked at him longer, as if sensing something unspoken. Wind moved across the metal roof, creating a low vibration in the space. Eli heard it clearly. In the past, that sound had tightened his stomach because it was too close to the thrum of a helicopter. Now, though his heartbeat rose slightly, he stayed where he was. He looked up at the ceiling, then back at the kids. A girl noticed his expression and asked, "Does that sound bother you?" Eli replied, "A little," then smiled. "But I'm getting used to it." She smiled back, like someone who had just received a gentle lesson. When the visit ended, the staff guided the kids outside. Eli followed last, glancing back at the room one final time. No gun in his hands, no explosions, no one challenging him or staring with suspicion. Just an old room, and the choice not to let it press down on his chest anymore. He stood there a few seconds, then turned and walked out. That evening, the center's common room was quieter than usual. The kids had gone home, and Eli sat at a table by the window, a small yellow lamp casting soft light onto a blank sheet of paper. His old pen lay on the table, the one he often used in therapy. Tonight, he did not write a journal entry like he usually did. He set the pen down carefully and wrote the first line in steady, slightly slanted handwriting. "I don't think I deserve to come back." He paused and exhaled. His hand rested on his chest like a punctuation mark, lighter than before. He wrote the next line, smaller, but firmer. "But I'm trying." Eli folded the letter and placed it into an envelope. He was about to stand when he heard the wind rise sharply in the hallway outside the window. He looked out. The sky was darkening, clouds thickening. He stayed seated, his hand resting on the letter a moment longer, as if passing into it a final measure of breath. A few weeks later, while Eli was organizing materials in the instruction room, the door opened. A woman stood there, gripping her bag, her expression caught between worry and relief. Her gray hair was slightly disheveled by the wind, her breath trembling as she called softly, "Eli." He stood still for several seconds, as if the world had slowed its turn. When he stepped closer, the woman opened her arms and held him tightly. She pressed her face into his shoulder and spoke the sentence he never thought he would hear again. The sentence that gently brought down every wall he had built over 4 years. "I don't need you the way you were before. I just need you alive." Eli closed his eyes, resting his forehead against his mother's shoulder, his hand placed on her back, with the caution of someone who had lost too much. But this time, he did not pull away. He did not step back. For the first time, he was no longer running from his life. The story of Eli Ward is not just about a homeless veteran who hit 5 perfect shots. It is the journey of a man who once fell, who once wanted to disappear from the world, yet still found the strength to stand back up from wounds no one could see. Eli shows us that some battles are fought deep inside each person, and sometimes the most painful thing is not the sound of gunfire, but the feeling that you no longer belong anywhere. From that personal story, the lesson widens far beyond one man. In crowded streets, there are people we pass by every day who are carrying entire private wars on their shoulders. A kind look, or a simple question, can become the bridge that leads them back to life. And a society is only truly strong when it knows how to reach out to those who seem to have fallen to the bottom. The story also reminds us that the past does not have to be a set of chains. When Eli dared to face the place that once broke him, he found himself again. We all have fears, but what matters is learning how to keep moving forward, no matter how much we tremble. If this story made you see the quiet people around you differently, or made you reflect on the road you have already walked, consider sharing it so others can learn as well, so compassion can spread just a little further. Thank you for staying until the end. I am always striving to bring you stories that are honest and deeply human. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories.